beginning of time, mankind has been fascinated by the possibility of exploring other worlds. Hollywood certainly shares this obsession. The movies have taken us to other planets, to distant galaxies. They've introduced us to Ewoks, Wookiees, Klingons, Vulcans, and Romulans. But it isn't James T. Kirk or Luke Skywalker leading these fantastic voyages. Instead, Hollywood's finest visual effects specialists are at the helm. In order to enter the final frontier, first you need a spaceship. Here's the Starship Enterprise, one of the most recognizable spacecraft in Hollywood history. For nearly 25 years, the Enterprise has taken viewers on countless voyages into strange new worlds. We spoke to Brick Price of WonderWorks Incorporated about the evolution of the Enterprise.
In Star Trek: The Motion Picture, one of the many things we did was to upgrade the Enterprise. And there were a lot of people that worked on that. It went from hand to hand. And originally it was going to be similar to the TV series. They wanted to bring it a little further into the future, though, when they were talking about it being a movie. And so we worked for, I don't know, 2 or 3 years on different incarnations of that model. They wanted to retain the same kind of a feel so that people could recognize it, be familiar with it. But they knew that vehicles like the Space Shuttle, for instance, were going to be having ceramic tiles. So they wanted to give it that kind of a feeling. They wanted it to look very clean. The Enterprise was supposed to be extremely high-tech. So one of the things that we did was a lot of experiments on painting techniques, on how to make it look like it was actually tiles. Ultimately, when the shuttle came out, the Space Shuttle, then we realized that it did look a lot like that. When people talk about the Enterprise, they think that there was just one model. In actual fact, there were a lot of different models, and range in scale from maybe 3 inches all the way up to an 8-foot model. In fact, certain sections of it were larger than life. I remember that they built one section for a docking bay that was enormous. It probably was 10th scale. We were working on a small Enterprise that was going to be used in a sequence with V'ger, and it was to have been approximately 9 inches in length. In fact, this is the one here that we're talking about, and you can see how the size of it. But when Gene saw this and had it in relationship to the V'ger, he decided that he wanted V'ger to appear larger, so the Enterprise ended up being smaller. But then this also is a good way to illustrate how the molding process was done, because on this you can see how the pieces come apart. So it almost becomes like a kit. They have to be engineered in such a way that when we're done, the pieces are lightweight, so that we can fly them on wires. So this is kind of the component sections.
Working on a Star Trek film, there's a whole history that comes with that. There's a design aesthetic for the Federation ships and for the Klingon ships. The Federation ships are very, very Art Deco. They're usually red, white, and blue, basically, and they're very recognizable as a Federation-type ship. The Klingon ships, on the other hand, are much more angular, they're dirtier, and they're usually kind of a green color.
Klingon bird appraiser. She's arming torpedoes. Fire them at the sky.
Well, the bird of prey is kind of an interesting story. It was needed for Star Trek 3. There were some design indications in the script of what it was supposed to look like. It was obviously bird-like because it was a bird of prey. It was supposed to be a very nasty-looking ship. It was supposed to have certain qualities of the Klingon design aesthetic. Neil Arodis was the art director, and he did a few sketches, and he also described to me, well, it should look like a football player. And he also did a sketch of a bodybuilder in this position with his deltoids popping out in this very aggressive pose. And so he handed over all these things to me and said, you know, see what you can do. So the final design of the bird of prey was a conglomeration of some of the early sketches, this bodybuilder, and a football player. In fact, if you look at the ship, it's got these deltoid muscles on it, it's got shoulder pads, and it actually has a chin guard. I took some of the suggestions literally and put a chin guard on the ship. And I think it was successful in that sense, that it looks Klingon and it looks like it's going to kick some butt.
To test what the models and sketches would look like in motion, the visual effects personnel used a camera technique known by insiders as the wank-o-matic.
Well, one thing we did on Star Trek VI was, in order to show exactly what the shots looked like, the shot length, the way the ship would enter and exit frame, instead of just using storyboards just rough two-dimensional sketches. We actually used a rough chroma key process and combined elements to do very, very rough moving storyboards. But they were very, very helpful. We used Ken dolls and Barbie dolls for the crew members on the bridge, and chroma keyed in the appropriate backgrounds. And they look kind of silly, but they actually were very, very helpful in designing the shots for the show. They were also helpful in that we filmed them. When we were done with them, we just set up a monitor and a camera, and we actually put them on film. And then the guys in editorial were able to cut those into the film, which, even though it's a funky, off-the-screen composite, it is better than a sign that says "scene missing."
One feature that is standard on all Star Trek spaceships is the transporter room. Beaming up remains a staple of the Star Trek television series and the full-length features. In this scene from Star Trek the Motion Picture, the transporter malfunctions, leaving a visiting party in intergalactic limbo.
Starfleet, boost your mat again. We need more signal. More signal.
Matt Beck of DreamQuest Images worked on the visual effects for this scene.
We actually had a little wire that was spinning around in a circle. And because it was a wire, we were projecting laser light on it, and it made a cylinder. And the cylinder was the tube in which the people stood to be beamed up. Then we had to distort these people horribly as the transporter malfunctioned. And to do that, we took like our little funhouse mirror made out of mylar, and the only way to describe it is a computerized belt sander with with various things like AstroTurf mounted on it to distort the mirror. And it was like, I mean, we were shameless about that. But, you know, I remember vividly that they said, well, it's Monday now, and we don't want to put any pressure on you, but you basically have to come up with something by Wednesday.
Oh, my God.
The effect worked extremely well, and we also learned that a bottle of tequila was involved in making this scene possible.
We used AstroTurf on Star Trek to create a distortion effect, you know, because the pattern worked great on our little funhouse mirror. And the bottle of tequila was for an optical guy who really helped us out at the last minute.
As you can see, movie makers will do just about anything to create the desired effect. The effects in George Lucas's Star Wars were so innovative that director Lucas needed to form his own effects facility to meet his creative demands. That workshop, Industrial Light and Magic, has gone on to win 11 Oscars. But Star Wars remains its greatest achievement.
5, I'm going in. Are you all right? I got a little cook, but I'm okay.
ILM Director of Post-Production, Ed Jones.
I think ILM's its own worst enemy in certain cases because we're always giving an objective, and that objective is to try to invent something new, to try to create something new. With that, you know, we never say no. And it's not in our vocabulary. We'll say we'll make it work. I think that's what Star Wars brought to the movie-going audience. It was a renaissance of visual effects. People sat through the first Star Wars. They walked out and they said, oh, that was a roller coaster ride. What happened? You know, and they got back in line. And everyone was just blown away by that type of imagery.
This scene was both seamless and exhilarating. The power trench, as it was called by those working on the film, was actually just a matte painting, but you'd never know it from watching the film. Disney's head of visual effects, Harrison Ellenshaw.
The whole idea of the interior of a Death Star and especially when they jump, they swing across the power trench, was that this thing had to go down forever. Well, you can't build going down forever. So fortunately, somebody said, well, we can use matte paintings to make it go down forever. The interesting thing was that they also wanted us to add the lasers out of their guns. He shoots real quickly at some Imperial troops that are across from him. And so we actually went in and then scribed on the bit of glass and did hand reveals for these lasers to go through.
One of the top 10 grossing films of all time, Star Wars was also responsible for the greatest technical breakthrough in modern film history. The process was called motion control, and it allowed simple models to create the illusion of intergalactic flight. ILM's 7-time Oscar winner, Dennis Murin.
Once I realized that what you could do with these tools were essentially with the computer control camera, and you've got a cameraman there who's shooting all the separate elements of the screen, of the scene, all blue screen, and combining them later on. And that cameraman was controlling the motions of all the elements and the compositions of all of them. You've got one person designing the shot. So it's all going through one person's mind, and you've got, it's like you're making a cartoon with models. There's no randomness. There's no throwing models past the camera or starting things down wires or stagehands, doing their best to get something to explode at a certain time. You're building up the shot layer by layer through one person's mind, and that was really a wonderful, powerful thing.
There is a great shot in Star Wars where people will clap, and people have said it's because it's such a great effect. And we all know what it is. It's the jump to light speed. That is probably the simplest effect in the entire film. It's probably the simplest effect in the last 20 years. George Lucas likened it to the good guys are driving down the freeway in a Corvette, and they're going like 60 miles an hour. They're going pretty fast, and the bad guys come up behind them in big black limousines, and they start shooting at them. And the good guy, the hero, with the square jaw says, watch this. He shifts down into third, floors it, the thing spins its tires for a quarter of a mile and leaves the bad guys in a cloud of dust and smoke. And everybody loves that.
Hang on tight, R2. You've got to come back. You wouldn't want my life to get boring, would you?
Star Wars also introduced us to a couple of robots named C-3PO and R2-D2. These futuristic robots have their origins in the earliest science fiction films.
This is no offense, but you are a robot, aren't you? That is correct, sir.
The 1956 science fiction film Forbidden Planet was ahead of its time. Special effects expert A. Arnold Gillespie's creation, Robbie the Robot, remains one of the best-loved science fiction characters in movie history. Eric Allard was so taken by Robbie the Robot as a kid that he decided to make robots his life. Today, he's one of Hollywood's top robotics designers.
The first robot that ever influenced me was probably Robbie the Robot from Forbidden Planet, which I watched several times as a kid. I think the thing that really interests people about robots is the fact that you can actually get a personality out of these things.
Nice climate you have here. High oxygen content. I rarely use it myself, sir. It promotes rust.
If you look at a lot of the typical movie robots, even going back to Robbie the Robot, obviously there was a guy in a suit there. If the story is good and it's being properly told, which of course is the most important element of a film, people will believe in the robot. People will believe that that's a robot, even though they may know it's a man in a suit. But I've just tried to take it a step further, and with all the robots we design, we make sure that there's space that defies the parameters of a human body, so there couldn't be somebody in a suit. The arms are too skinny, there's space between the body and the neck, so there couldn't possibly be an actor in there. And yet, we're able to give it a personality by giving it basically the same tools that an actor has.
For the 1986 film Short Circuit, Eric Allard designed a fully articulated robot called Johnny 5.
Disguise! Camouflage! Hi!
Number 5!
Stephanie! Change color! Attractive! Nice software!
We ended up building 15 number 5s, of which 8 were fully remote control, and 7 were non-remote control, what we called stunt bots, the ones that we'd push off bridges and push off trucks and that sort of thing. We had 3 that were this Bunraku cable-operated style from the waist up, and then we had 8 miniatures
that had steerable parachutes for the scene where he comes off the bridge, and then we had the trash robot that pushes him off the truck, all of which we did in 3.5 months.
Long line drive to deep left center. Heidi's going back for it. He's...
Robot alert. Number 5 located. Engage and capture. Do not destroy. Number 5, access code 29. Stay where you are. Number 5.
Feel free.
Stay where you are.
Number 1, you're out of there.
Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry set lofty standards for his visual effects designers and makeup artists. Everything the Enterprise encountered had to be based on some sort of scientific reality. That goes for Vulcans and Klingons. To ensure that his law was never forgotten, Roddenberry wrote a Star Trek Bible that is required reading for every effects specialist on board. One man who carries on the Roddenberry tradition is Richard Snell, who received an Oscar nomination for his makeup work in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country.
Gene Roddenberry, when he wrote the Star Trek Bible, had included a brief description of the backgrounds of Klingons. Generally, they were reminiscent of the Mongols. In previous movies, up until 5 actually, the Klingons had a real, what I call a cookie cutter approach, where they just stamp out the same basic design over and over again. On Star Trek 5, we began to spread out the designs so each Klingon could be individual, and with that ground being broken in 5, on 6, we had hundreds of different designs, which as a sculptor and artist was what it was all about for me. We got to play.
To be or not to be? That is the question which preoccupies our people, Captain Kirk. We need breathing room.
Earth, Hitler, 1938.
I beg your pardon?
Well,
Creating that Klingon look is a very involved process, but with the help of our model, Richard shows us how the Klingon look is accomplished.
Well, the process begins by slicking back the actor's hair. This is a prosthetic adhesive. The actual edge of the prosthetic is as thin as a tissue paper. Subsequently, all these prosthetics are used only once. And this is a paint which has pigment put into it, which we call Pax paint. It's basically the same product with water added, thinning it out. The hair goods we use are actually human hair. Each hair is hand-tied into a little lace net, one hair at a time. The lace is glued in, and it virtually disappears. Minor things, such as these eyebrows going on at a certain angle, can really change the face of your makeup design. Go down at this angle, he tends to be perceived as not quite as innocent, almost humorous. But if we take the eyebrows and we put it in an up angle, it's just something we innately as humans see as being more demonic or more evil. For Star Trek VI, we designed over 300 prosthetics that had to be built, cast of hundreds. So we had quite a bit of makeup going on. It was an involved process. In the case of Chris Plummer, he wanted the evil not to be because of the makeup, but because of what was inside, what he was reading internally into the character. And he wanted to look like, unlike, rather, any other Klingon. And I suddenly realized that he didn't want any hair at all. He wanted to be the first bald Klingon, which caused me great consternation because the whole backside of the head in this area I had virtually left unsculpted because I knew it was going to be covered by a wig. After that time, I sculpted through the night and molded through the night and didn't go to sleep, and got the product out a couple days later, and everyone was happy. And I have to say, in retrospect, it was a very good choice. Chris's choice for that design was right on the money. The eye patch actually has its own story. We knew that the eye patch, we didn't want it to be attached in the normal manner, and we had considered tying it on with a string and knew that the Klingons wouldn't do it this way. Neela Rodas, one of the artistic directors of the movie, decided it'd be a good idea if it were bolted to the skull. Another interesting thing about the design and the attention to detail that we put into our characters, and this is probably never seen on screen, but I know it's there, is the fact that each one of the bolts that bolts the eye patch to Chang's head has a little Klingon emblem, kind of like a Phillips screwdriver, if you will. So Trekkie fans, look for it.
It's a foregone conclusion none of these people have ever seen an extraterrestrial before.
Snell is also in charge of producing the most famous prosthetic in movie history, Spock's Vulcan ears.
Essentially, this is done the same way we do a prosthetic for the forehead for the Klingons. We take a casting of Mr. Nimoy's ears, then sculpt the ear tips on the ears, after which we go through design approval. There have been subtle differences throughout the years, from 1965 till now, of how they're sculpted and how they look. And Mr. Nimoy is very particular about it. So this is the molds that we use for that. What we do, this is a silicone mold. We have the ear on the inside with holes drilled into it. The holes are drilled there for the overflow of foam latex. When we inject the foam into here, it overflows and oozes out the top. We then bake it in an oven, and what comes out is a prosthetic like that. This is the foam, which is basically rubber that's been whipped up to a consistency of meringue and then put into a large injection gun and injected into molds like these. It sets inside the mold, then we put these molds inside the oven. We have a couple of special ovens that bake at exactly 200 degrees, and after about 3 hours, that vulcanizes the rubber and it becomes permanently like this. It's like a sponge, very soft, and as you can see, it has these tissue-thin edges, and it can move quite well, which is how we get that movement in the forehead. If it's sculpted thin enough, you get a lot of movement in the forehead. So there they are, Spock's ears.
Richard has worked on many different characters on many different movies. His makeup work can reflect as many varied emotions as the characters themselves.
If we take the pupils away altogether, it takes on a completely new connotation. Not having pupils can be very disconcerting.
Just like the NASA program that put a man on the moon, outer space films require ambition, imagination, and tremendous technical prowess in order to go where no man has gone before. That's a wrap.